So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to encounter Jesus, the teacher, in the Gospels. And there is a great deal to be said about the lesson our Lord gives us, and much to learn from, especially in who he addresses in their context, and not just what he says to them. It remains incumbent upon us as his disciples to probe the depths of these teachings as best we can, and with as much fervor as we dare, when applying them to life in the 21st century as opposed to the first. And depending on what we encounter when we read the Gospels, it's prudent to recall that so very much has changed given our understanding and experience of the world, despite the fact that there are others who might seek to give evidence to the contrary and qualify such remarks with the pretext that Jesus Christ is the same as he was yesterday, as he is today. Be that as it may, there remains a fundamental question when we find ourselves emerging from such a binary posture. Where are we, each of us, in relationship to that evidence? That's kind of a perennial question, isn't it? Where are we? Or more to the point, where are you, if you want to be biblical about it? As a friend of mine would say, a question of that ilk goes all the way back to Genesis. You know, when God goes looking for Adam and Eve in the cool of the day and finds them sewing fig leaves together rather than basking in the bliss of an unmerited perfection. I guess you could say that life from the beginning was and remains complicated. And so God asks each of us, where are you? And the echoes of that question reverberates down through the ages, from Adam and Eve to Abraham and Sarah, to Jacob and Rachel, to Moses and Zipporah, David and Bathsheba, and so on and so forth. Those echoes, they reach us even now. And sometimes they haunt us as much as they comfort us. And I think the reason why they ultimately challenge us, especially the teachings like the one from today, is because some of these questions, some of these teachings are not just difficult to probe in a first century context, but are tough to talk about regardless of time and place. Given the fact that some harm has been done in the way Christians have interpreted them and place much of our judgment on principle rather than on grace, especially when it comes to divorce. For if these teachings are anything, they are sensitive. They are personal, or at least folks take them personally. And maybe that's the reason why I reference real people and real situations when we have our time together. For tragedy as well as temptation is just as evident in our lives as the trust and tranquility that is promised to us if we have but the courage to see in each other the face of God, despite our brokenness and the bands of gold we give one another in faith. In the middle of all that is this moment. And if I see God anywhere in these stories and in these teachings, it's in you. Every one of you. It's in our lives. Not the Herodian court or the temple. It's here at the intersection of Ninth and Dewey, in Bartlesville, rather than in Galilee. I know it's a fine line, right, between Israel and Oklahoma. But there you have it. Jesus' teaching hits close to home today. Not the one about suffering the little children, though I'm sure if you ask some of the ladies who used to run Sunday school at St. Thomas, Back in the 80s, they might have used that word in association with me and my peers. I know it sounds cliche, but I have never met a more dedicated, perceptive, and fair-handed group of women in my life. And this recognition comes after 20 years plus of remembering how they would frisk some of us before we entered the nave. Checking for crayons and the occasional racquetball. But don't ask questions about that one. But there were also some of the ladies who ended up dealing a pretty heavy-handed blow to my family when it imploded in the early 90s. Nobody and no place is perfect. If you haven't heard, life together is complicated and messy, even in a deacon's family. And when infidelity is added to the mix, that can and usually does spell disaster, whether life is seen in the moment as sacred or secular. But you know what? Life together is also remarkably tender and beautiful. And that is true whether you find yourself in community on a whim or through your vocation. Grace is always at the ready, even though we might not be. In whichever way you come to know community, and whatever way you come to answer the question of where you are in relationship to Christ's teachings, maybe even the one that's spoken about today, well, the where of it all is often not realized, I've learned, until some wound is uncovered or some scar is formed from its healing in time. I'm sorry, my friends, but loving and living knows more than simply happy days, sentiment, and principle. All you have to do is just ask anyone who has loved and lost. Or I should say, just ask anyone. And with teachings like the one given to us today, I've come to know more about the God of grace in listening than I have judging things both done and undone. When Jesus speaks about divorce, one scholar says he is speaking out against the Herodian understanding of individuality, while others against the societal structure of ancient Judaism. And you know what? Both of them are probably right. But it doesn't stop the fact that all I see when I read this text are the faces of my parents. Not to mention those who have found their way to this altar, these altars in our churches, because divorce was not an option somewhere else. One would have a hard time convincing me that when I place the host in the hands of those who come here, that the tears they shed are a result of a hard heart, rather than one that is broken open by the dance of both grief and grace. And so how we come to these teachings is both personal, very personal, and scriptural. What matters most, I think, is in understanding that all is governed by the long arc of grace, and that wherever sin is manifest, there is always an avenue of return. My parents each found that out in their own way, and I know neither of them as adulterers, but lovers, redeemed, though never reunited. I suspect that many of you have come to your own understanding and experiences with this teaching. And I would say that as those who are called to love and minister to the world with arms wide open, what matters the most when we encounter the myriad of reasons behind divorce is neither the label or the blame, but the wound and the balm needed to aid in its healing.